So, my name's Paul Cheshire. I'm Professor of Economic Geography here at the LSE, and this is one of a series of lectures we've had this year, dealing with different aspects of the urban world. And I'm very pleased indeed to welcome you, Alison. So we've got Allison Nemo tonight to talk to us on the transformation of London east and west, more or less, which she has had a big hand in, or is still having a big hand in. She's had a very distinguished career in the sort of interface between planning, real estate and development, and urban regeneration. She's been recognized in many ways, and I think is one of the rather limited number of recipients of the RTPI's gold medal. Is that right? And now, just about 2 years, she's been the chief executive of the Crown Estate. The Crown Estate is one of those, should be much better known, but I think still relatively unknown, major forces, facts in British life. So Alison's in charge of it, and I look forward very much to your speech, Alison.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Paul. So transforming a city from London's East End to the West End. London's a true global city, but what I love about it is also a city of little towns, distinct neighbourhoods and villages, and I live in Bermondsey, which I think is a perfect example of a real neighbourhood, and I think this really sets London apart from other cities that have had this grand plan approach. And the great London estates, of which the Crown Estate is one of them, has helped have this enduring impact on London and the shape of London over many centuries. So first of all, the Crown Estate, we're one of the oldest, well, we are the oldest of the London estates, and I do mean really old. Our origins date back to 1066, when William the Conqueror assumed control of all land in England under right of the Crown. And we've endured over the centuries, clearly changing with the city, and hopefully providing a role model for some of the new estates, particularly in Canary Wharf and East London, that are now being established. So tonight I just wanted to really touch on my last 10 years in London, my personal experience and some of the reflections on two really extraordinary projects. One in the East End and one on the West End. Both, on the face of it, look and feel very different, but if you take a closer look, I think there are a number of really important themes underpinning the success of both of them. The most important four being vision and ambition, you know, that real sort of scale and vision. Secondly, stewardship, and by that I mean taking a long-term and holistic approach to development, very much centred on placemaking. Thirdly, a strategic approach, so looking at the ownership and bringing land together in a portfolio approach. And then last, but probably out of all of those things, most important, clear leadership over time, dedicated delivery, and then that ongoing management. And I think it's a timely discussion to be having tonight in how we look back and look at how London has changed and developed, and how we go about reshaping the city of the future. Many challenges we have in London, not least sustainability, population growth, the housing debate that's going on at the moment, but also broader challenges in terms of technological change and continuing the success of London as a creative and living city, as well as being a global city. As Paul said, for my sins, I'm a town planner and a charter surveyor, so fairly rare breed. But my career really turned into a passion when I was in Manchester. a bomb blew a big hole in the middle of my adopted home city of Manchester, and you look at that and you think, well, how would you respond? And the challenge led by the City Council was to turn a very negative event, turn adversity on its head, turn it into a real opportunity to reshape the city and create a bigger and better and more civilised city centre. And so my career is very much developed from big, complicated city centre regeneration projects into running the Crown Estate, which I don't know how familiar you are with them, but hopefully you'll be more informed by the end of this talk. But it's an £8.6 billion business, which might surprise many of you. So tonight what I want to do is just bring out a little bit of what I've learned along the way and share with you really what's quite a personal story. So come with me on a whistle-top tour of two remarkable projects, starting with the East End of London. The Games was obviously fantastic, the largest sporting project in the world, but if you really look beneath that, it was really about regenerating a huge swathe of East London. The second story, as I said, feels a world apart. Is the fascinating story of Regent Street and the West End. A great piece of city planning championed by the Prince Regent, owned by the Crown Estate, and 2 centuries later is still one of the best, most famous, most iconic shopping streets in London. So, first of all, to the East End and London 2012. As I say, let's look through the headlines of this fantastic global event and look behind what we were really trying to do, which was in essence was to create a new piece of city. I started on the Olympics back in December 2003, and I worked on the project for 8 years up until really a year out when the venues were finished and we were in the sort of last countdown to the Games. So it's quite an extraordinary story, and the real question is, well, how on earth did we do that? People forget right at the beginning of the bid in our sort of Olympic adventure, sort of really how tough it was. There was huge antipathy, difficult to believe now, but huge disagreement as to whether we even wanted the Games in the first place. We were collectively beating ourselves up about Wembley Stadium. Do you remember that? I can't remember how late that was going to be. And there was a real bad joke around at the time that Wembley was only going to be the only venue that we could guarantee was going to be ready in 2012. And this was everybody's favourite cartoon. This is what the Olympics was going to look like in 2012. It's an architectural model of how it'll look, which is basically a building site and half finished. And you know, as a nation, we'd really lost our confidence in developing these sort of big mega projects. But London had a great story. We'd hosted the Games twice before, both times in West London, both times at short notice, one to do with the First World War and the Second World War, and one to do with the eruption of Vesuvius. But this time, the Mayor, Ken Livingstone, was determined that the Games were going to be in East London and it was going to drive that much bigger regeneration programme in the East End. We took inspiration from all around the world. We looked at past Games, and we also looked at some of the amazing things that had happened in London over the years, not least the Festival of Britain back in 1951, and looking at the legacy that it left in the city, both physical and cultural. And the site selected in East London, we always sort of say, if you wanted to make a project really difficult, you would put it in the crack of the A to Z, you know, have it in 2 London boroughs. But Ken Livingstone had a very wicked sense of humour, and the site actually went over 4 different local authority boroughs. So a tough challenge. The park itself was about 500 acres, so a very large area, but put in the village in Stratford, and it was double that. And I remember very vividly my first visit out to the site in 2003 of very much a sort of polluted and derelict post-industrial landscape. 13 kilometres of power lines marching down the valley through where the village was going to go and through where the stadium was. One of the most polluted sites in Europe, fragmented ownership, crisscrossed by a whole range of roads and railways. It was very much the city's backyard, a dumping ground for difficult uses, and there were all sorts of uses in the area, from the old Hackney dog track to travellers' sites, scrapyards, and the most famous local landmark, Fridge Mountain. So it was a really mixed area, and yet you could really see the potential. A fantastic network of canals and rivers and waterways right on the edge of the city, and of course right close to the edgy and really creative parts of Hackney. And it was also a site with a fascinating history. They invented petrol here, and where Fridge Mountain was the old Yardley factory, which was very famous in terms of a number of very famous artists. Technically, London was a strong bid, but so were the others. We were up against a pretty stellar lineup of other international cities: Paris, New York, Madrid, Moscow. The scale of our ambition in this transformation was both our biggest challenge, but also our biggest advantage. We did, to muster some support, did some great marketing actually, some very patriotic marketing, make Britain proud. But I have to say, back then, creating the sort of public sort of support and enthusiasm behind the bid was pretty tough. I was lucky enough to be part of the bid team in Singapore. And it still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I think of that day, the 5th of July, 2005. You can hear the tension, the London presentation, colleagues come back, Tessa Jowell, Ken Livingstone, they're in tears, they're emotionally so hyped up after the London presentation. The votes are cast. The other cities fall out one by one. First Moscow, then New York, then Madrid. More votes are cast. We go head to head with Paris. And then there was this long pregnant pause till the evening for the final session. Everyone's assembled for the final vote. 58% of the world's media, and there are a lot of them, are in front of the Paris delegation. Good old BBC is loyally in front of the London delegation. Jack Rogge seems to take forever opening the envelope, and he utters those immortal words: "The games of the 30th Olympiad are awarded to London," and life was never going to be quite the same. The world went mad. We were texting colleagues, a few of them are here tonight actually, in Trafalgar Square. And it was an extraordinary moment. I don't know, I think a lot of my friends and colleagues remember that moment when they heard on the radio that London had won the Games. What a party, what a high. 24 hours later, we land back into London, into 7/7, and the world looked very different the following morning. But we had a job to do. My job was to set up the Olympic Delivery Authority, to get on with the job of the delivery. First stop was Treasury. We had those power lines, 13 kilometres of power lines to underground. We had a contract the size of a telephone directory to let. We were told it would take at least 5 years to do. We had 3, and we had no budget, and it was going to cost £250 million. So first stop Treasury, and to get some money and to get the whole project moving. The scale and complexity and the speed of the project meant we had things to do differently. We had to be innovative, we had to be smart. We couldn't do things in a sort of traditional, organised, sequential way. We had to twin and triple track a lot of what we had to do. But the fundamental approach we took was a master plan approach. So it was very much looking at how we created a master plan for the games, but how we created that in a way that we designed a new piece of city and then came back and overlaid the games. We learned a lot of really important lessons for other cities about how the games was an extreme event, and if we were going to get it right and get it right for legacy, then we had to design for legacy and then basically expand to accommodate the games. This master plan then set the whole overall framework of what came next, and it bought us a lot of time to then do all of the detailed design on the individual venues and the infrastructure. And we set up a very streamlined planning process. So the planning committee met once a fortnight, every week, for 4 years, and handled over 2,500 planning applications. So hugely complicated process. We set and were set pretty tough targets on everything from sustainability, accessibility, design quality, a lot of work on local jobs, skills, training, and these were all embedded into the planning conditions. And I remember there were 365 planning conditions attached to the master plan approval, and then there was also a big Section 106 agreement, so that locked all of those commitments in. And that became really important to us when we hit the financial crisis and there was round after round of value engineering. Having those commitments locked into the master plan was absolutely critical and provided a really important backstop for the team. It's very rare that you get the opportunity to plan a new piece of city on anything like this scale. And in terms of scale and complexity, it was really 5 projects rather than one project, or if you like, one project with 5 stages. Stage 1 was obviously the land assembly, demolition, relocations of all the people and uses on the site. Stage 2 was very much about build one of the largest construction projects in Europe. Phase 3 was then put on the most fantastic, largest global sporting event in the world, with the whole of the world watching. Then when the party was over, deconstruct, and then the final stage, 5th stage, was about constructing the legacy, and that was going to be one of the largest regeneration projects in Europe. The delivery was underpinned with streamlined powers. We had an Olympic Act passed on the 1st of April 2006. This established the ODA and gave us planning powers, amongst other things. The Mayor and the London Development Agency had really focused on assembling the site through one of the largest compulsory purchase orders in Europe, and this was a really good example of cross-agency working. The CPO assembled over bought out over 300 firms, all sorts of things like traveller sites, allotments. It was a very complicated thing to orchestrate, and I think the London Development Agency never got the credit that it really deserved for that. But for us, our first priority was getting an agreed brief and budget. We made a lot of promises during the bid, and we really had to focus down on what were people's expectations and what could be delivered within the timescale. And there was a lot of negotiation, a lot of changes around the bid book to really focus on what was best for the legacy, and then how could we be flexible in terms of delivering for the games. So in the end, we used a lot more permanent existing venues like Wembley Arena that weren't in the original bid, and we built a number of the most of any Olympic city, more temporary venues than any other Olympic city, and this is just to illustrate the scale. It was this was the basketball venue. Everyone called it the meringue. It was that sort of beautiful white building, 18,000 seat venue. A temporary venue of this scale had never been built in this country before. The other key challenge was about building the team, growing a team from one, which was me when we came back from Singapore, into a very large and sophisticated delivery machine. Time, money and budget were key priorities, but in reality the programme was king. We set out the programme. This was the 2006 programme, and it didn't change. And I remember my chief exec, David Higgins, sticking this on the wall in his office, and he basically said, that's the programme. We called it 241 was our shorthand for the programme. 2 years to acquire the land, build the team, plan, design and procure. 4 years to get on and build it, and then 1 year to test prior to the games, or what we always thought was our contingency. And that was it. Very simple programme, simple plan, non-negotiable. That's what had to be delivered, and that's what we all were very focused on setting out to do. Town planning was absolutely critical in terms of that delivery, and we worked very hard with the local community and local boroughs. And, you know, in all honesty, that was a tough thing to do. For many locals, the Olympics was like this big mega project that had sort of landed out of space and was very much a given. And it didn't feel that they were part of it. And of course it didn't help then, for security reasons, we had to put a 12-kilometre fence all the way around the park. So it's tough delivering these big mega projects in what are sometimes fragile local communities. The early years very much focused on the big clean-up. We had to literally scrape the 500-acre site clean and wash it and sort of wipe 200 years of industrial activity. Until I saw this slide when I was putting these together last week, I'd never noticed the cat there before. That was Mike's slide, actually. We were busy relocating frogs and newts and all sorts of things on the site, but the thing that became a real cause célèbre were the cats on the site. And Joanna Lumley even sort of got behind the rescuing the cats on the site, and Blackjack became quite a cause célèbre. So I'd forgotten all about it until I saw the slide. So we had to clean up the soil, so remediating the land, relocating in terms of ecology, and then creating very sort of sophisticated new sort of coir matting and wetlands to accept the 380 odd wetland plants, the 4,000 trees, and the lawns and the gardens that you now see in East London. And we had to do a lot of demolition. We demolished about 200 buildings, cleaned up the waterways, and built a whole complete new network of infrastructure right across the site. So on the slide there you can see our deep foul pumping station. It's the only deep foul pumping station that's ever been on the front page of the Architect's Journal. So we're very proud of we used to call it Pinky and Perky. So even the utility buildings and the infrastructure, a lot of thought, a lot of design went into them. And then we had to reconnect the site. So huge amounts of the new energy centre, pipes and cables across the site, and then 30 new bridges to reconnect the site into a single site. The next critical phase of the project, there was then getting the substructure and getting the venues out of the ground, and then probably the single biggest and most challenging part of the project was the village. So you can see Chobham Academy in the foreground here, and then the village, building 2,700 homes within 3 years. Gave quite a lot of the team a lot of sleepless nights. It had never been done before, and I'd hazard a guess that nobody would really want to do it again. And this sequence of aerial shots just really try and show that sort of scale of transformation and the speed of transformation. So this was November in 2008, and really in terms of the pictures, you can see a little bit of earth moving going on. This is the main sort of north-south Lee Valley river, and this was Stratford and where the village was going to be. And then a year later, and by 2009, you can start to see the broadcast and media centre coming out of the ground. You can see the stadium already taking shape, and all the cranes around Stratford, and a little bit of the velodrome starting to come out of the ground. And then by the time we fast forward to November 2010, you can see the broadcast and media centre, the wonderful meringue, the basketball venue really starting to take shape. You can see the wonderful roof on the aquatic centre, and the village is really starting to take shape, and the roof's just gone on the velodrome. And you can start to see that wonderful wetland bowl in the north end of the park starting to take shape. And then by February 2011, you can start to see the wetlands and the planting, and the temporary sides going on the aquatic centre. So just to give you a flavour, you know, that's an incredible amount of development, and a lot of the investment was going in the ground. And at the peak, we were spending about £150 million a month. So incredible scale of activity. But for me, the real transformation came when in spring 2011, when the park literally went from brown to green, and all of a sudden this sort of dirty big construction site started to look like this wonderful new park that really started to take shape, with the fantastic wild flower meadows, and then the north end of the park up near the velodrome. The venues, as I say, were delivered by an incredibly dedicated team of people. Over the full length of the project, there were about 30,000 people that worked on the Olympic Park, from our apprenticeships to our main contractors. And we set ourselves some really tough targets in terms of local employment, high levels of diversity. We didn't have as many women working on the project as we would have liked to have, but we had some real successes through our Chicks and Bricks programme. We're getting some fantastic young women, plumbers, engineers, and plumbers and plasterers onto the site, and we had a lot of fun doing that. So very much our job at the Olympic Delivery Authority was creating the theatre for the Games, and Seb Coe's team and LOCOG was really all about putting on the show, and what a fantastic show it was. I remember this moment on what was called Super Saturday, when Jessica Ennis won her gold medal. It was just an extraordinary moment, and then the medals came thick and fast after that. So a fantastic Olympics, but also a fantastic Paralympics. And the whole magic of the event, the athletes, the volunteers, the army sort of stepping in at the last minute to sort of rescue the position from G4S. I mean, it was just the most extraordinary thing. And I think London came alive and was a changed city. So if we fast forward to today, much of the Queen Elizabeth Park is now open to the public. How many of you have been out there recently? Quite a few. I think it's great, actually. I've been out quite a few times. I think the legacy company, the Transformation, they've done a fantastic job. The first residents have moved into the village. The pupils are now in the school. The venues are either open, like the Copper Box, and have had some great events in them. And others are still due to I think the first event's being held in the velodrome this weekend. So I think it's going to, I'm absolutely confident that it's going to change East London and actually change London forever, and do what Ken Livingstone wanted it to do at the beginning, which was really to tip that economic balance from the west to the east. The little picture in the middle is of Impkin, and I've just seen Phil came in actually. The team that designed the park did a fantastic job, and this was in the wet woodlands, and they were very naughty one day and sort of snuck Impkin in through security, so that there was always somebody living in the park during all the construction, and when it was closed down for security, keeping an eye on everything and spreading good spirits. I hope he's still there. I'm not sure if anyone. I hope nobody's stolen him. So just very briefly, some of the lessons from the Olympics. We very much used the games to inspire. We proved that when we set our minds to it, we can do it. On the games, nobody wanted to pick up the phone to Jack Rogg and say, it's going to be late. Can we move the date? Can we move the year? It had to be delivered on time. Politics is key, getting that cross-party political support day in, day out over the whole course of the project was absolutely critical. It was hard won, but absolutely critical. And then getting the communication right, as I said at the beginning, not just trying to work hard to get media and get people behind it, but also the internal communication on the site so that everybody was really, really clear about what success looked like. Finally, it's a team game. Culture and leadership were really important. There were a lot of agencies, a lot of disparate agencies involved in delivering both the big build and the games, and it was really important that we all worked together. We had one chance to get it right, and it was an extraordinary team that delivered the project. And then values at the heart of everything. So that's really about where we went back to on the key decisions. We'd made promise in Singapore, the greenest games and accessible games, a safe games, about pushing boundaries and creating this extraordinary sporting event, but also an extraordinary legacy. And that was the commitment we'd made, and I think the team delivered big time on all of those promises. And I just wanted to finish the Olympic section with just a picture of the velodrome. As I say, they hold their first main event this Saturday. If you get the chance, go. It is the most extraordinary, beautiful building, a fantastic unison of engineering, architecture, probably the most sustainable building, sports building, certainly in Europe. And if you are an adrenaline junkie, get the chance to cycle right up in the top of the track. It's like flying. You have to be a bit of adrenaline junkie, but do go for it. It is extraordinary. But go and have a look at the buildings. Go and have a look at the park. It's a fascinating story for London. And so to London's West End and Regent Street. Paul talked about the Crown Estate being a bit of a secret, so I just wanted to say a little bit about the Crown Estate before I come to Regent Street. An extraordinary organisation. We scribbled this diagram, this picture within the organisation, just as a way of actually trying in one piece of paper to capture all the different things that we do. So it talks to being an extraordinary organisation. It talks about our geographic spread right across the country. It talks about our urban estate. You can see Regent Street here and Piccadilly and our sort of development portfolio. Some of the lovely little touches like the bees in Regent Street. We're very proud of our Regent Street honey. It looks to our estate down at Windsor, where we manage a large area of Windsor Great Park. It talks about our values and how we put sustainability right at the heart of the business. And it talks about one of the largest rural estates, commercial rural estates in the country, from the cycle tracks and mountains up in Glenlivet down to large areas of Wiltshire. It talks about our offshore business, our wind farms, our marine minerals and dredging, our 17,000 moorings that we have around the coastline. and it talks about also how we do business. So the team very much being at the heart of the Crown Estate, and then how we do business very much in partnership. But it's not just this amazing portfolio of wind farms and rural, urban, owning over 14 million square feet in London that makes us special. As I said at the beginning, we trace our origins back to the Norman conquest, although the modern history of the Crown Estate goes back only 250 years. And that goes back to the reign of George III, when after his coronation back in 1760, the king surrendered all his hereditary revenues to Parliament in return for an income for life in the form of the civil list, now the sovereign grant. So a lot of history, but in essence now we are a modern business created by Act of Parliament, and in practice we've got two stakeholders, the monarch, who remains the owner of the underlying assets, and then Treasury, who is the recipient of our annual profits. But as I said, over these last 2.5 centuries, the Crown Estate's very much changed, and we're a modern business. And we're very much a values-driven business as well. Our core values are commercialism, integrity, and stewardship. And we have a very passionate and skilled team at the Crown Estate that deliver great commercial results, but also live these values as well, and we see the two going hand in hand and very much reinforcing each other. And as I said at the beginning, we're a major player. We're now an £8.6 billion company, business, and over the last 10 years we've delivered £2 billion to the Treasury. So help taxpayers in terms of public spending. And you could say we're one of the very few businesses that actually pays 100% tax. All of our revenues, all of our net revenues go to Treasury. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the Crown Estate. As I say, it's an extraordinary estate in land with a great history. So Regent Street. This is a map of the West End, or a bit of the West End, in 1804. So this is very much yes, there was life pre-Regent Street. Regent Street's predecessor was called Swallow Street. It was a street full of pawnbrokers, plagued by professional highwaymen, and described by leading journalists of the day as a long, devious and dirty thoroughfare. Regent Street, as the name suggests, was the inspiration of the Prince Regent, later to become George IV. And basically Regent Street was designed to connect his rural royal estates. He had about 500 acres up in a place called Marylebone, which is now, you'd recognise as Regent's Park. And he basically wanted a wonderful processional route that connected his rural estate to his palace in St James's. And it was basically to be a grand ceremonial route. And was really a project of staggering vision at the time, and huge ambition. And the Prince brought in John Nash in 1809 to create this wonderful new street. And John Nash was probably our greatest ever town planner. And an act was passed to allow the estate to basically develop the street, and it gave us compulsory purchase powers and allowed us to borrow the grand sum of £600,000 to build the street. I guess a lot of money in those days. So Regent Street was completed in 1826, and it was the world's first purpose-built street dedicated to retailing. But the street you see today is not Nash's original street. It was completely redeveloped in the 1920s under King George V, and the retail offer was changed and developed, although this amazing shot back then shows that some of the super brands that we have on the street haven't changed much. So you've got a very early version of Hamleys there, and then on the right-hand side of the picture, you've got a very old version of Liberties. The Regent Street Association was established in 1925 and is still going strong. It's the oldest tenants association in Britain and was instrumental in stopping the whole-scale destruction of Piccadilly Circus and Regent Street. Some of the transport planners wanted to turn Piccadilly Circus into a giant car park and then have a grade-separated approach to sort of pedestrians and cars on Regent Street. But thank goodness that they stopped that and common sense prevailed. In the 60s, Regent Street was pretty seriously hip and trendy. I don't know if you remember the Kinks song, Dedicated Follower of Fashion. I'm not going to sing it. They seek him here, they seek him there in Regent Street and Leicester Square. But by the 70s and 80s, I have to say, Regent Street was looking a bit sad. It's seen better days. I haven't seen a yellow cortina on Regent Street for a while. Tartan shops and airline booking offices were very much the order of the day. Not too many dedicated followers of fashion. I think they'd all gone to Carnaby Street. And the street was really started a long and slow decline. But 2002 marked the next stage in Regent Street's remarkable history. Many of the long leasehold interests along the 2-kilometre street were falling in, and it gave the Crown Estate a real opportunity to take back control of those long leasehold interests and to set an ambitious new and long-term strategy for the street. And it worked. I mean, you look at Regent Street today and it's completely transformed. And this has been the result of a 10-year investment programme. In fact, our 10-year investment programme has been so successful it's now a 20-year investment programme. And the key to success is that we've taken a long-term view. We've outlined a very clear vision and used the totality of our ownership to carefully curate the street and the offer and really reinvest heavily in the fabric. It's now very much an iconic street. But in truth, behind those grandiose facades, the units were really very small. So a lot of what we've been doing is buying up a lot of the land behind Regent Street, investing in that beautiful facade and creating large flagship stores that international retailers want. And so we've created a smaller number of larger, real flagship stores and really pulled in people from right across the world, some fantastic brand names and international retailers. And Regent Street's more than just retail. We're promoting high quality mixed use developments. This is our Quadrant 3 development, one of the most sustainable buildings in London. Fantastic, great quality design, won all sorts of awards, and that's absolutely transformed that bottom end of Regent Street, right next to the Café Royal Hotel, which has been completely transformed, and itself very much for 100 years being the centre of fashionable London, with many legends such as Oscar Wilde, Winston Churchill, right through to Ziggy Stardust. The fictional figure was retired in the bar at a very famous party there. We're attracting, these offices are attracting global and European headquarters to London, many top companies, most recently Twitter and Telefonica. But in doing Regent Street, we've also learned that the spaces between the buildings are just as important as the buildings themselves. And we've invested about £25 million into the public realm. This is the famous diagonal at the top of Oxford Circus, getting rid of that horrible cattle pen and really opening it out and making a great piece of streetscape. But also investing in much wider pavements, improving air quality, and having a whole range of traffic-free days. When we first said we wanted to do it on Regent Street was shock horror, but now we're doing more and more traffic-free days. We had the whole of August, the weekends, traffic-free this year, and we've had all sorts of fun with fashion shows and then some great culture events and street parties in the street. In St James's, we're very much following similar sort of principles, clear vision, using our extensive ownership, and we're investing over £500 million in the new combination of reinvesting in the old fabric, refurbishment of some of the most fantastic of London's period buildings, and again, getting right back to those sort of fundamentals of placemaking, quality, and creating destinations which aren't available anywhere else in London. And our newest development in St James's is St James's Market. This is a £320 million joint venture project. This was the old, literally historic St James's Market that when Nash built Regent Street did away with the market, and we're putting back the public space where the market used to be and doing a combination of refurbishment, modern new buildings within the conservation area around this fantastic new square. So just to conclude, ultimately good city planning is all about long-termism, or what we at the Crown Estates like to call stewardship and placemaking. It's about having a vision, it's about having ambition, and then turning that vision into reality through a master plan, and importantly through teamwork. In some ways I feel I've almost come full circle. I started my career as a young planner, very wet behind the ears in those days, as a young planning officer in Westminster City Council, and it's great to be back in the West End and being able to influence in a very positive way the shape and the development and the restoration of so much that we own in the West End. But when I came back to London to work on the Olympic bid 10 years ago now, something quite unexpected happened, and I fell back in love with this amazing city. And I know it's a passion that many of us in this room share. But with that goes a responsibility on what we do and how we do it, and how we all contribute to keeping this city great. And perhaps London's mayor should follow the example set by the ancient city of Athens, and the oath made by the young men of Athens when they became citizens at their swearing-in ceremony. Amongst other things, they had to say, "I shall not leave this city any less, but rather greater than I found it." And I think that's something that we should all, as citizens of London, sign up to and really think about not what this city can do for us, but what we can do for this city. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Alison. That was a fascinating talk, highly visual and very stimulating. We've got some time for some questions. So think of your questions. We have roving microphones. I can see 1, 2. Now, I'm going to use my privilege as chair to ask the first question, which is, I mean, both these two projects you were talking about enjoyed advantages of big scale, and just how important is that scale to the success of these projects, and how applicable is that to the general problems of urban regeneration?
I think if we're honest, if you use the analogy of a body, the Olympics was sort of like open heart surgery, and I'm not sure that that's a way that you would choose to do regeneration projects, because with scale comes challenge and very significant risk, and trying to create a new piece of city in such an extraordinary short space of time, it's very difficult to make sure that you get it right. And I suppose Regent Street is a bit more like keyhole surgery, or I think really good quality regeneration is about keyhole surgery. So you have the master plan and you do it in an incremental way over time. But I think the big advantage of the Olympic, I think, you know, the Lee Valley in that part of East London, where you could see from the slides with the power lines and with the amount of contamination and the opportunity with the rivers, you really did need a big strategic approach to really unlock the true potential of that area. So you needed a lot of investment and you needed to be able to join up a whole myriad of different land uses to create that overall impact. But I do think some of the best regeneration schemes I've seen are actually quite small scale and intuitive, and then they can change and develop over time. You were talking earlier about some of the new towns, and you build a new town and it's all built at the same time, and it's quite difficult to really get that whole sense of, if you like, the West End and the history and the mix of uses and different accommodation at different price points, and to get that real, I suppose you call it heart and soul of a city, really. I think Manchester gave us a great opportunity, principally because the bomb went off outside the Arndale Centre, which wasn't the most beautiful bit of Manchester, but there it allowed us to actually break through and get rid of some of the 1960s disasters that we had in Manchester and reconnect the city back up through New Cathedral Street to the medieval quarter. So it allowed us to do some quite big bits of reconnecting the city, but then it created the space for other people to come in and do things. And I think out of all the things we did in Manchester, actually getting people to come back and live in the city was probably the most significant, I think, the most significant change in Manchester, and almost re-civilising the city by bringing that life into the city for people to live. I mean, and again, the first development we did, One Deansgate, everyone thought we were completely mad, you know, people wanting to live in Manchester city centre. 20 years later, it's an incredibly vibrant city centre. And I still go back and I still think what an extraordinary thing to do, to take something that's a real disaster and to turn it on its head and create a real opportunity. Whereas the Games was really a sort of positive opportunity and force for change. But the city had to get behind it, and the mayor had to get behind it to make sure that we got the legacy right.
Thank you very much. So, 2 questions over here. Start. Can you give your name when you ask a question? You don't have to, but...
Yes, my name's Richard Sawyer. I'm a retired GP living in Clerkenwell. Basically, in both your things, you had authority, the Olympic Authority and the Crown Estate Authority, to develop the site. Mm-hmm. Just north of us, we've got the Royal Mail site, which is large. And suddenly the mayor has stepped in and said he's going to plan it. Can we trust him?
Well, that's a very difficult and very political question you just asked me, really. At the end of the day, the mayor's got some good people on his team, and he's obviously doing it for the right reasons, which is actually looking at what does London really need in this site and the opportunity, and it's clearly a strategic opportunity. And well, King's Cross was the same. It straddled 2 different local authority boundaries, and I think to be able to get a coherent plan that works across boundaries is probably really important. I think you're answering your question for you, really. But I think you probably can. He's got some good people on his team. But the trick is, as residents, to make sure that you're inputting into the master plan and whatever the planning framework for that area is, so that it works for you and it does create something that sits at the heart of your community, as opposed to something that's alien. And you've got time, I would hope, to do it. But if the mayor gets behind it, then actually having that sort of real focus on delivery will be really, really important to get done. But I don't know all the ins and outs of the detail of it.
Thank you for your very diplomatic answer. Yes, there.
Thank you, Alison. It's quite an inspiring lecture you gave us. My name is Lei Guo. I'm a architect and planner working in a London-based architectural practice. My question is, because I've just been to the Olympic Legacy Park the past weekend, is very impressive, and I've been to the aquatic center to swimming there actually. And one question I found, because right now the price of the tickets is very cheap, it's like £3.50, something like that. I just wonder if there's any the governmental incentive scheme still in the projects to sort of like, I don't know, boost the starting point, and then later it's gonna run its own sort of like profitable scenario, and what is the future programmatic concerns of the whole Olympic Legacy Park? Are you gonna, I don't know, bring more like program, like public program, or what that gonna be? Thank you.
There's probably
very
some people
much.
in the audience better able to answer that than me, actually, that are still working on the project, but I'll have a go, and I'm sure they'll correct me. But I mean, the focus on the legacy of the Games obviously wasn't just the physical venues, but the whole sort of programming and getting people active and creating this fantastic new, the first park for 100 years in London, and putting it in the East End where they needed it. And the advantage of bringing the land together and creating a large project was so that various elements could cross-subsidise each other. And having a public body, the London Legacy Development Company, was very backed by the mayor, underwritten by the mayor, was all about making sure that you got that balance between commercial development and sort of economic activity, housing, and a mix of housing in the village, so you've got affordable housing as well as private rented housing. But at the heart of it, having a public programme for all of the venues. So even the challenging discussions around the stadium was all about not just having a football club in there, but opening it up and making sure that it was accessible for community use and that you always had a mix of uses. So you've got Lee Valley running the velodrome, so it's going to be cycling heaven with the 1 mile track, off-road cycle tracks, as well as the, if you're really brave, the BMX track. So I think it creates a really good overall offer. They brought on board an operator in Greenwich Leisure that is a non-for-profit company, and I think there's a really strong commitment in the long term to make sure that both the sporting events and the elite events, as well as the sort of how you animate the park and bring in festivals and things, will work in a very balanced way. So I think there's a very strong commitment to doing that. Obviously a huge amount of public money gone in to create that space and to make sure it's there for the benefit of all Londoners for a long time. Did you enjoy your swim?
Got one at the back there, and then we'll move around the hall after that.
Hi, my name is Richard. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on the housing shortage in London and how some suggestions around how it could be solved or resolved over time.
Yeah, big issue again. I think there's the shortage of housing. There's also the affordability of housing. So and the two things are clearly linked. London First have just done a really good report, which actually has 15 recommendations in terms of how you actually look at unlocking supply across London. Everything from putting pressure on the mayor to unlock the land that the GLA own and sit on, as well as looking at, well, where could we put, I suppose, like examples like the Olympic Village, where you can put quite high density residential around transport, so coordinating transport and residential development. But we've got to be building more houses. I think about 50,000 new homes a year to keep up with the increase in demand. I mean, London's population is growing. It's grown about 1 million over the last 10 years, and is looking to grow another 1 million, and then another 1 million in the next 10 years. So we're sort of running fast to stand still, really. So I think now's the time for the mayor and government to come together to really look at how we can unlock supply. I think a lot of the money that was available to go into affordable housing just isn't getting to the right places. So I think the previous mayor had some pretty tough targets on affordable housing and held developers to them, and I think that needs to be revisited, and I think developers should, and we always in the Crown Estate commit to building the affordable housing that we, rather than paying money that sort of sits in somebody's account and doesn't get used to deliver residential. So I think it's a very complicated area at the moment. Obviously, a lot of international money coming into the city. I suspect, London's housing's always been quite unaffordable in London. I remember when I got my first ex-council flat right at the beginning of when I lived in London, and I had to sort of shack up with my sister because that was the only way I could afford to buy a flat. Interest rates were 15.5% and was really crippling. So the dynamics of the market are very different now. And I think we need very much a sort of joined up government and mayoral view of this. But I think the public sector need to lead the way and create a very clear framework for the private sector. And I think the private sector are there and they will do more. But if we can unlock some of these big strategic sites in London, that will be a really big step forward.
Thank you. Students are organising an event upstairs tomorrow night on this very subject. You have a question here.
In Żuranskie, and I work in real estate private equity for many years, most recently for Deutsche. First of all, thank you, Alison, for a fantastic lecture. And second, I have a question actually on something else, not related to planning so much. Before I came across the Crown Estate, and I did because I used to work for the government of Singapore, GIC, and we worked together and looked at a few projects together. I was always kind of an opinion that the Crown Estate is kind of a UK version of a sovereign wealth fund.
Was it kind of what, sorry?
A UK version of a sovereign wealth fund. I kind of had this opinion, and now listening to your lecture, it's obviously very different. In fact, to me, it looks more like a West End development company, similar to Capco, similar to London and Regional. And I'm just curious, is this a strategy to keep it this way? Why haven't you looked at it more as a sort of fund, which is managing, the Crown's money? In a way, maybe more similar to Grosvenor, because Grosvenor has moved sort of into the fund type of estate management.
Yeah. There's been quite a lot of speculation, and the Labour Party have been talking about converting us into a sovereign wealth fund. I think people are a bit confused, as Paul said, about who we are and what we do, and we've been trying to stand on more platforms and explain more clearly. But in many respects, we have a commercial mandate. We have similar characteristics to the Capcos, similar characteristics to the Grosvenor. I think what sets us apart from, if you like, a more traditional, just any old other property company, is that we take this very long-term approach. And we build to last, and we build for quality. And particularly in London, with our big land holding, we take that very long-term view, and we can work the wider portfolio. But the thing that makes us different to anybody else is just that sort of diversity on the picture, owning half the foreshore, owning the sea out to 12 miles. I mean, that's an empire, this 1.5 times the size of France. And that's a monopoly position in the sea, so that needs to be balanced. But having green energy, agriculture, our our 4 million square feet of retail outside of London, plus that core portfolio in London. People have sort of said it's like having all the squares on the Monopoly board, really. I mean, it's an extraordinary estate to have, but run and manage really for the benefit of all of you in the room. All our money goes back to Treasury into public funds.
One questions at the back there. There, you, yes. In the further reaches of the hall. Yes, there at the back, sorry.
Hi, John Cooney, engineering graduate and possible future planning student. I just had a question about airport expansion in South East, and obviously the Crown Estate has a lot of the seabed, as you said. I'm wondering what the Crown Estate's position on something like the Thames Estuary Airport, however unlikely that may be now, given the report. What the position will be on airport expansion in South East.
The Crown Estate doesn't have a view on most things that are happening in London. I mean, we are very, very focused and active in terms of what makes London a successful global city, and obviously good communications and around are very important to that. But we wouldn't have a view on where an airport should be or airport capacity. That's very much for Howard Davis review on the government. But depending on then what the government then decided where it might be, we might have a role to play in facilitating that. We'd be very much sort of facilitating it at the margins.
At the front here, and then immediately behind.
Hi there. Again, I echo everyone's sentiments. Thank you, Alison. That was very interesting. 2 questions for you. I wanted to ask, you mentioned 30,000 people were involved within the whole Olympic project. What I was curious about is how many people did you have within your close team, both within that particular project and also within the Crown Estate? How does that function?
Okay. Two things very different. I mean, when my official title at the Olympics, well, it changed over time, but it was basically I was one of 8 directors. I was the director of design and regeneration. A lot of what we were doing was overseeing the early design of the venues, the overall master plan, and delivering on a number of things like sustainability, and not just on the park itself, the whitewater canoe course, Broxbourne. So a number of venues right across London. My immediate team probably never got to any more than about 50, 55 people. It was very much a sort of outsourced model. So we worked very much with selected individual design teams, and then we worked very early days to bring on board a delivery partner. So it was more than a project or a program manager. It was a delivery partner who was quite heavily incentivized in delivering against time, budget, and quality. The ODA grew from 1 into probably a couple of thousand people at its peak. LOCOG, who were putting on the event, grew from a tiny small team to over 20,000 people at the peak. You can imagine with all the volunteers and the bus drivers and everything. So it was a sort of massive operation. But in terms of the ODA, it was very much design teams and then contractors on each of the venues, and then the delivery partner taking an overall view. In the Crown Estate, when you look at what we do and the sort of geography and the reach, people think that we're a really big organisation, but we're not really. We're less than 500 people, and again, most of what we do is outsourced. And even within those 500 people, 200 of them are down at Windsor. Basically, we run Windsor as a sort of in quite a traditional estate. Whereas, as I say, in the main Crown Estate operation, it's really quite a small, tight senior team. But on something like Quadrant 3, the building, you saw maybe only 12 in the Crown Estate will be involved in such a massive development, but the overall team might be 1,000 people.
Immediately behind.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Shipley. I'm a chartered surveyor at CBRE. I work in the valuation of commercial property in the West End, and I did my undergraduate at LSE. I wanted to ask, what were the most challenging aspects of the Regent Street improvement programme?
Well, I've only been around for 2 years on Regent Street, so I can't claim any of the credit for it. I suspect right back at the beginning was quite a change in the overall strategy and approach. The Crown Estate, like the Grosvenor and many of the major London estates, had got quite a sort of hands-off, passive approach to managing their assets. You know, you sold somebody a head lease for 100 years and then you just collected the rent every year. So I think that was probably a fundamental shift in how the Crown Estate thought about how it did business. The Crown Estate's history has come out of government and public service. So I suspect that the next big challenge is actually to find a team and bring in the sort of client-side capability that was able to articulate that vision and pull together a team of people to then actually make it happen. And we call the guy that's run Regent Street for the last 10 years or so, we call him Lord Shaw of Westminster. I mean, he's taken the project and driven it relentlessly to a fantastic street that you see today. So building those long-term relationships with all of the top retailers, building the relationships with Westminster Council. So obviously planning is absolutely critical in all of this. Building their trust that we could actually knock down buildings in conservation areas, redeveloping behind facade, doing some really contemporary, the Quadrant 3 scheme, doing some really sort of contemporary buildings within conservation areas, and that real mix of conservation, heritage, what retailers and office occupiers really want in terms of contemporary new space. So I would have thought, getting the whole project moving at the beginning and getting people behind it, getting the expertise in the organisation to be able to really drive it through, and then just all the day-to-day challenges that many of us have in terms of how you get innovative projects built and developed out through the system, if you like.
At the back there.
Hi, I'm Neil. I read that TK Maxx were refused tenancy by the Crown Estate, so I was wondering if there is objective criteria to assess potential tenants, and I was also wondering if you've ever shopped at TK Maxx as well.
When it comes to Regent Street and St James's, we have a clear strategy, which is a sort of property strategy and the vision in terms of what we want to achieve, and then making sure we effectively curate the street so we're getting the right mix of tenants is really important to the success of Regent Street, and really important to how we've managed to succeed where others perhaps haven't. So getting that really top flight mix of international tech. So bringing in people like J. Crew, their first store outside of the US is really important. So making sure that we've got the right mix is essential. And unfortunately, some shops aren't AAA grade in terms of what's right for Regent Street, which doesn't mean to say that they aren't very good retailers in their own right. And actually, we TK Maxx are in a number of our out of town, our regional shopping centres. So we have a good relationship with them, but it's about curating and having the right people in the right places. And yes, I do.
Okay,
I don't want to give away all my secrets.
We'll move over to this side again at the front here.
My name is Xiang. I'm a postgraduate student studying economy. Thank you very much for fantastic presentation. And being a Chinese student, I have experience of 2 last Olympic Games. One is in London, another is in Beijing. So I can't help myself to compare the meaning and the purpose of these games to these completely different cities. So for Beijing, and it was like the first time China officially opened itself to the rest of the world. So we were really passionate about it, and you know that the first time we failed, and the second time we succeed. So it was like no matter how much money we spent and how many efforts we put in, we still need that to be succeed. But for London, it's already like a historical, very successful city. And as you mentioned, that London has always been a quite like West-focused city. And so I can't help myself to ask the original, essential purpose when back to your, like, is that called submission committee? Or when you were beating like 10 years ago, the original purpose and the meaning of London holding these Olympic Games?
Thank you. Cities bid for these big projects, not just Olympics, but for many, many different reasons. And as you said, I think Beijing, we always saw Beijing as the big coming out party, really, and they were trying to say something about China as a nation and open for business and the kind of society they wanted to be going forwards. I think for London, it was a question of actually reasserting itself as a global city, so that we weren't slipping behind. So really sort of putting us right out there, right in the middle of the sort of the glare of the global TV cameras. But probably something more fundamental than just the big sporting event. And it was about our city, and it was about the innovation in the UK. And I think it was a great success story for our engineers and our architects, and actually just showcasing the world what we're good at. I think the Olympic ceremony just being quirky, and the creativity in London and the talent that we have here, and that we're not some stuffy backward empire country, but actually have a look at London and have a look at the UK and where we are now as a country, and to be able to showcase some of our best talent on and off the field. So it was about, yes, the event and what it was saying about ourselves, but then also it was a great opportunity, and the Mayor saw the great opportunity to create, I suppose, a real impetus and a real focus of investment to transform the whole East End of London. Not just on the back of the games, but to create that sort of momentum in the east of our city. And as I say, I think they would have done that. But 2 very different games. The scale were very different. I remember the front page of the Evening Standard berating us that we weren't building this wonderful bird's nest, and London was going to have a flat-pack stadium. And it was always going to be very different from Beijing. I remember being at the opening ceremony in Beijing and thinking, how on earth are we going to beat this? And I think London just did it differently, and it did it with its own style and its own creativity and a big dose of sense of humour. And I still pinch myself to just see what our athletes did, how they performed at home games, and the volunteers, and as I say, it sort of created a real magic which I think exceeded everyone and anyone's expectations in this country. And I hope that we still can leverage that really good feel-good factor. But very, very different. But I'd love to go back to Beijing and see what they've done with the legacy.
Thank you very much. So, down the front here.
Hello, my name is Barbara Reichwein. I work on monitoring and evaluating social initiatives, not commercial ones. But you mentioned so much the long-term impact of your work, and at the top right corner you had the positive long-term impact view of the Crown Estate, and you talk about the bottom line that you give to the Treasury. but are you maybe selling it a little bit short and thinking about the longer term change that you create for the city? And is that something that you would be interested in tracking or measuring, or are you already doing any of that?
Good question. I rattled through far too much this evening. I covered a lot of ground, so I didn't really have a chance to say, apart from the top line of what the Crown Estate is and what we're doing currently on Regent. But we started a project a couple of years ago which actually looked at, well, what value are we as the Crown Estate bringing to UK PLC beyond just the cheque that makes the Chancellor smile when we send it every year. And we've been working with the New Economics Foundation, and we've done this report called Total Contribution, which really takes the totality of what we do and actually starts to measure it good and bad. And we're beyond carbon neutral as a company already, given our sort of forests and our rural estate and our green energy business. We thought, well, how do we capture what we're delivering in terms of the totality of it? And I'd be very happy to send you a copy. It's a short report. It's on our website, and that gives a real platform to sort of say, okay, well, how can we do better, and how can we leverage more around how we create long-term value, but long-term value in the round. And we've been one of the first businesses, big businesses to commit to integrated reporting. So really looking at our business model, how we really add value for our stakeholders, our customers, and showcasing some of the things that we do that people just don't know we're doing, whether it's a fantastic story about biodiversity and all the amazing things we do down at Windsor, or whether it's in Regent Street. We have a work placement programme, and we've just placed our 500 young unemployed Londoner into and put them into everywhere from the Ritz to Superdry and up and down the street. And some fantastic things that we're doing. Andy Hughes from the Crown Estate team actually is a fantastic thing we're doing on the whole of our sustainability programme, which, yes, we're doing some great stuff on our new developments, but it's really what we do on our, the other 15 million square feet that we have in London in terms of how we run and manage our estate. So it's a great story, but that would be a lecture on its own. But have a look on our website, and a lot of our reports are on there. I think it's a great question because more and more businesses are looking at, well, what is the core purpose of business, and actually how can we contribute beyond just the economic activity. Yes, we're here to make a profit, but much more than that. And in the Crown Estate, what we're trying to say is, with our long-term outlook on business and the special portfolio we have and the special responsibility we have on behalf of managing these assets on behalf of the nation, if we can't get that right and be a leader, then it gives everyone else an excuse not to do it. So it's early days, but it's something that we're focusing on. We're getting some interesting stuff. Gosh, challenging questions. Somebody else been using
So we've got someone who's been trying to ask a question for about 20 minutes there, so and then we'll move back this way.
Thank you very much. My name is Duca Frankhausen. I'm a development consultant at DTZ. The London landed estates clearly have an expertise in managing estates and placemaking. I was just wondering if you think there's an opportunity for the landed estates, like the Crown Estate or Grosvenor, to transfer those placemaking skills to the opportunity areas, so places in the East End where there's large-scale development going on that will require a lot of placemaking to be successful.
So about the transfer of skills from the West End to the East End, I don't know how to answer that question really. I mean, we don't have a portfolio in the East End of London. I mean, we work with partners and we're very happy to provide whatever sort of expertise that we've got, but it's quite a specific expertise. Around retail, it's around West End, it's around West End offices. We wouldn't pretend to be experts in sort of broader regeneration programs. Although, obviously that's my background and my passion. But yes, where we can spread good practice, where we can, certainly from the Olympics, we had a learning legacy programme. And Paul's comment about, well, the Olympics is so big and it's so complicated, what can people really learn from it that might be relevant to smaller scale projects or other projects? And the answer to that is a lot. Not the totality, but just the individual ways that we did things, or ways that we innovated, particularly on our sustainability programme. Everything from Olympic mix sustainable concrete to some of the design innovation on things like the velodrome. We had a very expert team of designers and engineers that sort of helped us on that front. So we set up a website, and again we work with partners from the RSCS to UK Green Building Council to sort of say there's some real gems in here, and let's not lose them, because we have this habit of always reinventing the wheel.
So, there, yes.
Hi, my name's Tom. You mentioned that there was some very high level of compulsory purchase at the Olympic site. What sort of strategies were utilised to reduce displacement and, I guess, social exclusion? And if those strategies have been successful?
Gosh, I don't think I can answer that one. I mean, what the London Development Agency tried to do was to relocate as many people as they could within the sort of broader local area. So whether it's Lance Foreman and his smoked salmon factory, or small businesses out into Barking, and a lot of residents were relocated in the local. One of the traveller sites was relocated locally. So I suspect that there'll be lots of theses written on this and lots of analysis done sort of over the long term. But I think the social change in the east end of London, I think it's only something that we'll really see over a long period of time, and to see whether that huge inequality between West London and East London, whether there's any convergence in that. And it's everything from health, right through to sort of employment, all the way through. I can't answer that question, but that was one of the key reasons for having the. But the Olympics was an event, and it created a sort of catalyst for that development, and it certainly wasn't going to solve all the problems of East London. But if you look back in history 100 years at Booth's map of East London, and you look at the sort of the concentrations of deprivation in East London, and then you fast forward 100 years and you think a lot of those patterns were still there before the Olympics, and you hope with something like the Olympics and the investment in the infrastructure, things like Stratford Station, for example, and one of the best connected places in London now, that will create that sort of fundamental shift, and then it'll allow more people to be more economically active and deal with some of those really deep-rooted social sort of inequalities. But I suspect to get a real readout on that will take quite a long time, and then you've always got the problem of people moving into the area and displacing the existing residents. It's a complicated question, that one.
We're running out of time, but just quick two more questions, one there and one here.
My question's not intellectual at all, but when you visit Regent Street, do you feel that you visit it as the chief executive of Crown Estate or as Alison?
We'll run another question together with that, if we may, Alison.
Yeah, depends which day of the week it is. I feel very proud walking up here. I just think it's such a fantastic piece of iconic London, and such beautiful buildings. And yeah, I feel very proud when I walk up, actually. But I do like getting the shot.
Okay, final question down the front here.
Thank you, James Walton, South 40 Group. sorry, another sort of finance question here, but I understand that the Crown Estate can't take on any debt against any of its assets, sort of unlike most property companies, but also, I suppose, unlike most property companies, you have the Treasury as your main finance partner. Has there ever been a time where you, were constrained on your finance and you wish you had access to different capital sources, or do you pretty much always get what you want when it comes to development?
The financial relationship with Treasury is a one-way street. We pass them money, they don't give us money. So one of the quirks of the Crown Estate Act is that we're, and you're quite right, we're not allowed to borrow. So what we did, it was my predecessor, we, out of necessity to raise money, because the estate needed a lot of investment in it, we went into partnership with the Norwegians, so their sovereign wealth fund, and we sold a 25% stake in Regent Street, which basically unlocked £500 million that we're now, all of the pictures you saw in the developments, we're now reinvesting in the estate. And so we did that out of necessity, but we've actually found that it works really well with us. So we still manage the whole of Regent Street. We've still got all the freeholds, and we're still in control. But it's given us a great partner with a lot of expertise and deep pockets, and one that's really bought into the long-term vision. So we've done another couple of those. We've done one with in Piccadilly and St James's with a Canadian pension fund, and our latest St James's joint venture is with Oxford Properties, who again is a sort of Canadian pension fund. So a few strategic partners that really get that sort of long-term view, placemaking, sustainability, and they're providing the investment that we need to deliver our overall vision.
Well, we've worn Alison almost to the ground, I should think. Thank you for coming. I've really enjoyed the evening and learned a lot, and most of all, of course, thanks to Alison for